The door clicked shut behind me, and a deep, unsettling silence filled the house like a cold wave. I could feel something was off even before I stepped fully into the living room. It was too quiet. Sarah had promised to be home early to put the kids to bed, yet there was no sign of her or them anywhere. My breath came in slow, deliberate pulls as I tried to steady myself, but an uncomfortable tension coiled in my gut. I could still smell her perfume lingering in the air, a thick, cloying scent that felt foreign, almost wrong. My eyes scanned the room. The place looked undisturbed, like a picture-perfect scene waiting for someone to walk in. Except no one had been here. No toys scattered around, no sound of laughter or tantrums, just emptiness. I checked my watch. It was way past the time Sarah had said she'd be home. She should have been here with the kids. Then, my phone buzzed. The bright screen illuminated with a message from our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins. "Just wanted to let you know the kids are with me. Sarah said you had an emergency at work and couldn't make it home in time." An emergency? My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't been called in for anything tonight. My mind started spinning, questions overlapping one another in a rush of unease. Why would Sarah say that? What emergency? I read the message again, disbelief flooding through me. Mrs. Jenkins sounded so casual, like it was no big deal. But this wasn't sitting right with me. Something gnawed at the back of my mind as I shoved my phone back into my pocket. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Without thinking, I headed upstairs, the old wooden stairs creaking under my weight. Every step felt louder, the sound reverberating through the unsettling quiet of the house. I pushed open the bedroom door, and there it was, Sarah's new dress, crumpled and carelessly tossed onto the floor. It still reeked of cigarette smoke and a cologne I didn't recognize. My chest tightened. She hated the smell of smoke. She would never. I clenched my fists, feeling the burn of betrayal creep in like a slow, sinking poison. The whole room screamed at me with its untouched bed, the faint, lingering scent of someone else hanging in the air. I bent down, picking up the dress, my mind racing with images of Sarah somewhere else, doing something she had no business doing. I didn't hesitate. I threw the dress in the trash with more force than necessary, the bag crumpling as if it shared my rage. I wasn't going to wait around like an idiot. If she thought she could waltz back in here like everything was fine, she had another thing coming. I stormed toward the closet and grabbed an overnight bag. My hands worked furiously, pulling out her clothes, shoving them inside the bag without a second thought. She was going to know tonight that this was the end of whatever secret life she thought she could live behind my back. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of her car pulling into the driveway. My pulse quickened, but I didn't stop. I kept packing. Each shirt, each pair of pants was a declaration. She was not welcome here anymore. The front door creaked open downstairs, followed by the familiar click of her heels on the hardwood floor. Her voice rang out, cheerful, light, completely oblivious to the storm brewing upstairs. "Babe, I'm home," she called, as if everything was perfectly normal. My hands paused, hovering over her half-packed bag. The moment of truth was here, and she had no idea what was waiting for her. I heard her footsteps coming up the stairs, each step slow, measured, as if she was blissfully unaware that her world was about to be torn apart. The bedroom door swung open, and there she stood, Sarah, smiling. But that smile faltered the second her eyes landed on the scene in front of her. The bag, the empty house, the fury in my eyes. "Where are the kids?" she asked, her voice wavering, a look of confusion crossing her face. I didn't answer. I just stared at her, letting the weight of what was about to happen sink in. She was going to learn tonight, learn exactly how much her lies had cost her. This was not just another one of her little secrets. Tonight, everything was going to unravel. Her smile vanished completely as she stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes darting between me and the half-packed bag on the bed. There was a brief flicker of panic, but she quickly masked it, straightening her posture like she was ready to regain control of the situation. "Where are the kids, Matt?" she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. I could hear the fear creeping in now. I took a step toward her, closing the distance between us, my jaw clenched tight. "They're safe," I said coldly. "I made sure of that." Her eyes widened, confusion quickly turning to fear. She knew something was wrong, but she was still piecing it together. She opened her mouth to say something, but stopped herself, biting her lip as if weighing her options. She had no idea what I knew, or how much. "Why are you packing my things?" she asked, her voice sharper now, like she was trying to sound strong. But I could see through her. She was nervous, her fingers twitching at her sides, and her eyes flicked toward the bag again. "You already know why, Sarah." My voice was like ice, so cold it almost felt foreign to my own ears. I reached into my pocket, slowly pulling out the phone she had conveniently left behind in her rush to get ready tonight. I had seen the messages, the ones from him, and they weren't something she could explain away as innocent. When her gaze locked on the phone in my hand, I watched the color drain from her face. She didn't even try to deny it, didn't put up that fake smile or pretend it was all some big misunderstanding. She knew the jig was up. "Matt, it's not what you think," she started, her words faltering as she stepped back, trying to retreat from the inevitable confrontation. "Oh, really?" I spat, taking another step closer, the phone still in my grip. "Because what I think is that you've been sneaking around behind my back. You thought you were clever, didn't you? Late work meetings? Out with friends? But you weren't as slick as you thought, Sarah." Her lips parted, and for a brief moment, I thought she might confess, might tell me the whole truth. But then her face hardened, and that stubborn defiance I'd seen before flickered in her eyes. "It was a mistake, okay?" she said, her voice rising. "It was just once." I cut her off, my anger flaring hotter. "Once? Do not insult me, Sarah. I saw the messages. I know about the nights you didn't come home until late. I know about the lies. How long has this been going on? How long have you been making a fool out of me?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't buying it. Not this time. I had already seen her face when she walked in tonight, all bright and happy like she had been somewhere she wanted to be. That wasn't the face of someone who regretted a mistake. That was the face of someone who didn't care about the consequences. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain. "I didn't want to hurt you. I swear, I didn't mean for it to go this far." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "You didn't want to hurt me? You have been hurting me, Sarah. For who knows how long. You've been sneaking around, lying, and betraying everything we built together. But guess what? It ends tonight." She flinched at the finality in my tone, her whole body shrinking as the reality of what was happening crashed over her. She took another step back, her heel catching the edge of the door frame, and for a moment, she looked like she was going to collapse under the weight of it all. "I want you out of this house," I continued, my voice sharp and unyielding. "You can pack your things, leave tonight, and go stay with him for all I care. But you're not staying here, not after this." Her mouth opened as if she was going to protest, but nothing came out. She stood there, tears streaming down her face, but I didn't care. Not anymore. I was done. I turned my back on her, walking away from the bedroom, leaving her standing there to face the wreckage she had caused. I stormed down the stairs, each step echoing louder than the last, the sound of her quiet sobs trailing behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, the anger burning so hot that I needed to get out of the house before I did something I would regret. But just as I reached the front door, I heard her voice again, frantic, pleading. "Matt, wait," she called, her footsteps hurrying down the stairs behind me. "Please, can we talk about this? You don't understand." I spun around, my anger boiling over as I glared at her. "What is there to talk about, Sarah?" I shouted, my voice reverberating through the empty house. "You cheated. You lied. And now you're paying the price. I don't need to understand anything more than that." She froze at the bottom of the stairs, clutching the banister like it was the only thing holding her up. Her face was a mess of tears and desperation, but behind the fear, I saw something else. A flash of anger, a flicker of guilt. "We've been drifting apart for months, Matt," she said suddenly, her voice breaking. "You've been so distant, so wrapped up in work and the kids. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. I felt like I didn't exist." Her words hit like a gut punch, but I didn't let them land. I clenched my fists, the rage in me roaring louder than her excuses. Don't you dare try to blame this on me, I growled, stepping toward her. You could have talked to me. We could have worked through it together. But instead, you ran off to him. She stared at me, her eyes flickering with guilt, but also something darker, something defensive. I needed to feel something, Matt, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I needed to feel alive. And you made me feel like a ghost in this house. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep myself in check, but it was impossible. Her words clawed at me, making the anger swell inside me like a tidal wave. And your solution was to betray me? I shouted. To sneak around behind my back? To destroy our family? How is that supposed to make anything better? Her lip quivered, her eyes glistening with tears, but there was no turning back now. I wasn't going to let her twist this around. She had made her choices. Now, she would face the consequences. Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't moved by them this time. I'd seen those tears before. Empty, meaningless. She was always good at making herself the victim. I wasn't falling for it. I didn't want it to happen this way, she whispered, her voice trembling as she struggled to keep herself together. I didn't plan this, Matt. I felt so alone. Alone? I spat, incredulous. You felt alone? We have 2 kids, Sarah. A house, a life together. What part of that made you feel alone? Her tears spilled over, but she wasn't crying for me. She was crying because she had been caught, because the facade she had built was crumbling. I could see it now, the way she was unraveling right in front of me. It was a mistake, she stammered, her voice breaking. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I know I screwed up, but I didn't want to hurt you. I shook my head, laughing bitterly. A mistake? This wasn't a mistake, Sarah. A mistake is one bad decision, maybe something you regret the next day. But this? I motioned toward the stairs where the bedroom lay, where her lies were unraveling. This was months of sneaking around, months of lying. This wasn't a slip-up. This was a choice you made over and over again. She looked down, unable to meet my eyes anymore. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed quietly, but I wasn't moved by her tears. I was too far gone for that now. How long has this been going on? I demanded, my voice cold and sharp. She hesitated, and I could see her trying to figure out what to say, how to minimize the damage. But there was no minimizing this. There was no way to downplay what she had done. 6 months, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. 6 months. Half a year of lies. I clenched my fists, trying to keep control of the anger raging inside me. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her feel the pain that was tearing me apart inside. And how many times? I asked, my voice dangerously low. How many times have you been with him? She hesitated again, her lips quivering as the truth hung between us, heavy and suffocating. A few, she whispered. I felt the world tilt beneath me. A few? I repeated, my voice rising. How many, Sarah? How many times did you sneak off to be with him while I was here, taking care of our kids? While I was here, thinking we were a family. She broke down completely then, her sobs racking her body as she collapsed against the banister, her face buried in her hands. I don't know, she cried, her voice muffled by her tears. I don't know, Matt. I didn't know how to stop. I stared at her, feeling nothing but cold, empty rage. You didn't know how to stop? I said, my voice trembling with disbelief. That's your excuse? She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide and pleading. I was lost, she whispered. I didn't mean to hurt you. I needed to feel something again. I shook my head, disgusted. And you thought betraying me, betraying our family, was the way to do that? You thought sneaking off with some guy was going to make you feel alive? She sobbed harder, her hands trembling as she tried to wipe her tears away, but it was no use. She was falling apart. I ended it, she said through her sobs, her voice barely coherent. I swear, Matt, it's over. I ended it. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. It was over? She thought that changed things? She thought that somehow made this better? You ended it? I repeated, my voice thick with bitterness. So, you want me to forgive you now? You want me to just forget everything you've done because you say it's over? She shook her head, her sobs choking her words. No, I know you're hurt. I know I messed everything up, but I'm telling you the truth now. It's over, Matt. It's really over. I couldn't take it anymore. The anger that had been simmering inside me boiled over, and I slammed my fist against the wall, the sound echoing through the house. You think that matters now? You think any of this can be undone? You destroyed everything, Sarah. Everything. She flinched, her sobs quieting as she cowered against the wall, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. But I wasn't finished. You know what? I don't care if it's over, I said, my voice dropping to a low growl. You're leaving. Tonight. Pack your things and get out of this house. You can go stay with him, for all I care. But you're not staying here. Her face crumpled, her lips quivering as she realized there was no saving this. There was no fixing what she had done. Matt, please, she whispered, her voice breaking. Please don't do this. I turned away from her, the finality of my decision settling over me like a heavy weight. I couldn't stay in the same house with her any longer. Not after everything. This is not a discussion, Sarah, I said coldly. You're leaving. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here. Not after what you've done. She stood there, defeated, her tears falling silently as she realized that the life she had shattered couldn't be pieced back together. And for the first time, I didn't feel sorry for her. This was her mess, her choice. And now, she had to live with the consequences. I stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me with a force that rattled the windows. I could barely breathe, my chest tight, every nerve in my body on fire. The night air hit my face, cold and biting, but it did nothing to cool the anger that pulsed through me like a ticking time bomb. I fumbled for my keys, my hands trembling as I jammed them into the ignition. I needed to get out of here, needed to escape the suffocating reality of what had just happened. The engine roared to life, and before I knew it, I was speeding down the street, away from the house, away from her. I drove with no destination in mind, the empty streets flying by in a blur. My thoughts raced just as fast, spiraling out of control, bouncing between rage and betrayal. 6 months. 6 months of lies. 6 months of her sneaking off, of her slipping away while I was home, clueless. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white, as the truth of it all sank in. I should have seen it. The late nights, the sudden work meetings, the distant looks. It had all been right in front of me, but I had been too blind, too trusting, too damn naive to believe she could do something like this. And now, everything was falling apart, crashing down around me, and there was no stopping it. I pulled into a gas station, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting long shadows across the deserted lot. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind still reeling. I needed to calm down, to think clearly, but it was impossible with the anger burning so hot inside me. I parked the car and leaned back in the seat, staring up at the ceiling, trying to breathe. In, out, but all I could see was her face. Those tears, that broken look in her eyes as I told her to leave. And for the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into my mind. Had I been too harsh? Had I acted too quickly? But the moment those thoughts appeared, they were crushed by the memory of those messages, the thought of her with someone else who had touched her, kissed her, while I had been none the wiser. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, the pain shooting up my arm, grounding me back in the present. I wasn't going to feel sorry for her. Not after everything she'd done. She had made her choices, and now she was going to live with them. As I sat there, the glow of the gas station lights flickering around me, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to just let this go. I wasn't going to be the fool who sat back and let her lie to my face again and again. I needed the truth, every last ugly piece of it. Without thinking, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I paused when I got to Tim's name. Tim had been my buddy for years. One of those guys who always knew things, had connections. He was the kind of person you called when you needed information, the kind of person who could find out the truth when no one else could. I hesitated for a second, my thumb hovering over the call button. Did I really want to go down this road? Did I really want to know how deep her betrayal ran? Yes, I had to know. I couldn't live with half-truths and unanswered questions. Not anymore. I hit the call button. The phone rang twice before Tim's familiar voice answered on the other end. Matt, man, it's been a while. What's up? Tim, I said, my voice steady but cold. I need a favor. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the casual tone in Tim's voice disappearing as he picked up on the seriousness of mine. What kind of favor? I took a deep breath, my hand tightening around the phone. I need you to find out everything you can about someone. Where they've been, who they've been with, everything. Tim didn't ask questions. He wasn't the type. Give me the details. I rattled off Sarah's information. Where she worked, the places she had mentioned, the timelines that never quite added up. As I spoke, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, like the anger was finally being given a direction, a purpose. I wasn't just going to let her get away with this. I was going to find out everything. Got it, Tim said after I finished. I'll start digging. Give me a few days. Thanks, I muttered, my voice hard, emotionless. You sure you want to go through with this, Matt? Tim asked, his voice lower, more serious now. This kind of thing. It's not easy to come back from. I hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Once I opened this door, there would be no turning back. I would know the full truth, whether I was ready for it or not. I'm sure, I said finally, my voice resolute. I need to know. All right, I'll be in touch. I hung up, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat and staring out at the empty gas station lot. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was sharper, more focused. I wasn't going to sit back and let her destroy our life. I wasn't going to be the fool who was kept in the dark. She had made her choices, and now I was going to make mine. I started the car, the engine growling to life as I pulled back onto the road. I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew one thing. By the time this was all over, I would have the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, the streets blurring together as my thoughts spiraled in every direction. I didn't want to go back home, not yet. I couldn't face the emptiness, the mess that was waiting for me there. I needed to cool off, but no matter how far I drove, the weight in my chest only seemed to grow heavier. The betrayal stuck like a knife between my ribs, twisting deeper with every mile I covered. Eventually, I found myself in an empty parking lot. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows that danced across the cracked asphalt. I killed the engine and sat in the silence, staring blankly at the dark, empty horizon. My mind was racing, but I couldn't settle on a single thought. Everything felt chaotic, torn apart, and I wasn't sure how to pull it all back together. I leaned forward, resting my forehead on the steering wheel. I had thought Sarah and I were solid. Sure, we had our ups and downs. What marriage didn't? But I never imagined it would come to this. I never imagined she would turn her back on me, on our family. But now, it all made sense. The late nights, the coldness in her eyes, the way she had started pulling away from me, bit by bit, like she was erasing herself from our life. And I had been blind, too busy with work, too distracted by everything else, to see it happening right in front of me. The sound of my phone buzzing on the passenger seat snapped me out of my thoughts. I grabbed it, my heart pounding, half expecting it to be Tim with the results of his digging. But it wasn't Tim. It was Sarah. Her name glowed on the screen, and I stared at it, feeling a strange mix of anger and hesitation. She must have known I had walked out. She must have known how serious this was now. But did I want to hear her voice again? Did I want to listen to more of her excuses, more of her lies? My thumb hovered over the decline button, but something stopped me. Against my better judgment, I answered. What? I barked into the phone, not bothering to hide the venom in my voice. There was a pause on the other end, and for a second, I thought she had hung up. But then her voice came through, small and trembling. Matt, where are you? Why does it matter? I shot back, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the phone. What do you care, Sarah? You got what you wanted, didn't you? Matt, please, she pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. I didn't want this. I didn't want it to end like this. You should have thought about that before you started sneaking around. I snapped, the anger boiling up again. You should have thought about that before you lied to my face for months. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible now. I know I messed up, but I swear to you, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean to hurt you. Her words hung in the air, but they did nothing to calm the storm raging inside me. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that her apologies meant nothing now. But instead, I swallowed the words and let the silence stretch between us. Finally, she spoke again, her voice desperate. Can we just talk? Please? Can you come home, and we can talk about this? We can figure it out. I clenched my jaw, the bitterness rising in my throat. What's there to figure out, Sarah? You made your choice. You chose him. Hell, you chose them. There was a sharp intake of breath on her end, and I knew my words had hit their mark. Good. She deserved to feel that pain. What do you mean them? She asked slowly, fear creeping into her voice. I felt a dark satisfaction wash over me as I answered. Tim's looking into everything. He's going to find out the truth, Sarah. All of it. And when he does, I'll know every dirty little secret you've been hiding. Tim, she echoed, her voice shaking now. Matt, you do not need to do this. I'll tell you everything, I swear. You do not need to drag this out. It's too late. I cut her off, my voice hard. You had your chance to come clean, but instead, you kept lying. You kept playing me like a fool. Well, now it's my turn to know the truth. So, don't bother trying to spin this anymore, Sarah. I'll know soon enough. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could almost hear her brain scrambling, trying to figure out what to say, how to salvage what was left. But there was nothing left. Not anymore. Matt, she finally whispered, her voice trembling, I know I've done terrible things, and I know I do not deserve your forgiveness. But I'm begging you, for the kid's sake, do not make this uglier than it has to be. Please, we can work this out. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head even though she couldn't see me. For the kids? You think dragging them into this is going to make me feel sorry for you? After everything you have done, you want to talk about them? Please, she whispered, barely holding herself together. Please come home. We can at least talk about it. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the end call button again. A part of me wanted to slam the door on this conversation, to walk away from it all. But another part of me, the part that had been tied to her for so long, the part that remembered the good times, whispered to me to listen, to give her one last chance. I let out a long breath, closing my eyes against the flood of emotions swirling inside me. Fine, I said finally, my voice low. I'll come home, but don't expect things to go back to the way they were. We're talking, and that's it. No more games, Sarah. Thank you, she whispered, the relief in her voice clear. Thank you, Matt. I hung up before she could say anything else, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat and staring out at the empty street. My hands were still trembling, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had no idea what was waiting for me back home. I had no idea how things would go from here. But I knew one thing for certain. The truth was coming, and I was not going to stop until I had all of it. I started the car and pulled out of the lot, the road stretching out in front of me like the long, uncertain path that lay ahead. One way or another, this nightmare was far from over. The drive back felt longer than it should have. Every passing minute, every mile, my mind kept spinning through every conversation, every moment where I should have noticed something was off. I could see now the signs had been there all along, small but unmistakable. The distant looks, the excuses, the way she had slowly begun to shut me out. I should have known, but instead, I had been too busy, too distracted to pay attention. And now, I was speeding toward a house that no longer felt like home, toward a woman who had shattered everything we'd built. The glow from the porch light was the first thing I saw as I pulled into the driveway. It looked so normal, so familiar, but the weight pressing down on my chest told me that nothing about this night was normal anymore. I killed the engine, sitting in the car for a moment, staring up at the house. My home. But it felt foreign to me now, like I didn't belong there anymore. Not after what had happened. Not after what I knew. With a deep breath, I opened the car door and stepped out. The night air was colder now, biting at my skin as I walked toward the front door. My hand hovered over the handle for a second before I pushed it open. The house was quiet, eerily so. No sound of the kids, no noise from the kitchen, just silence. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet feeling different now, like the sound belonged to someone else's life. I found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen, her face pale. She had been crying, but I wasn't moved by it. Not anymore. I had seen enough of her tears, and they didn't change anything. She stood up as I walked in, wiping her eyes quickly as if trying to make herself presentable. "Matt," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from crying. "Thank you for coming back." I didn't respond, just walked past her and sat down at the table. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. I could feel it pressing down on me, every second of silence making it harder to breathe. Sarah sat down across from me, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. "I know you're angry," she started, her voice shaky. "And I know you have every right to be. I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to explain, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to understand why it happened." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "Why it happened?" I repeated, my voice cold. "I think I understand plenty. You wanted something more. Something I wasn't giving you." She flinched at my words, but she didn't argue. She just stared down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "I felt lost," she whispered. "For months, I felt like we were drifting apart. You were always working, always tired. And I felt invisible." "Invisible," I echoed bitterly, shaking my head. "So what? You thought sleeping with someone else would make you feel better?" "It wasn't like that," she said quickly, her voice rising in desperation. "At first, it was just talking. Someone who paid attention to me. Someone who made me feel like I mattered. And then what?" I snapped, leaning forward, the anger bubbling up again. "It turned into something more? You started meeting him in secret, sneaking around behind my back?" She nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes again. "It was never supposed to go that far. I didn't plan it. But once it started, I didn't know how to stop. He made me feel alive, Matt. Like I wasn't just a mother or a wife, but a person. Someone worth paying attention to." I clenched my jaw, the words stabbing into me like knives. "And I wasn't enough for that?" She looked up at me, her face crumpling in guilt and sorrow. "You were everything to me. You still are. But I got lost, Matt. I lost myself, and I didn't know how to come back." I shook my head, bitterness swelling in my chest. "You lost yourself? So you thought betraying your family was the answer?" Her tears spilled over, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I never meant to hurt you. I swear, I didn't. But it happened, and now, I don't know how to fix it." For a moment, I just stared at her, the woman I had loved for so long, the woman who had been my partner, the mother of my children. I had never seen her like this before, so broken, so vulnerable. But the part of me that had once cared for her was buried beneath the rubble of everything she had destroyed. "You can't fix this," I said finally, my voice hard. "What's done is done." She sobbed quietly, burying her face in her hands as the weight of my words hit her. I didn't move. I didn't reach out to comfort her. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. After a few moments, she wiped her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll leave. I'll pack my things and go." I nodded, my heart heavy but resolute. "That's for the best." She stood up, her movements slow and hesitant, like every step was painful. I watched her walk to the stairs, her shoulders slumped in defeat. But before she disappeared, she turned back, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, Matt. For everything." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just watched her go, the sound of her footsteps fading as she walked away. When the house was finally silent again, I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty chair across from me. The weight of it all crashed down on me, heavier than I had anticipated. She was leaving. The woman I had built a life with, the woman I had once loved more than anything in the world, was walking out of my life. And despite everything, Despite the betrayal, the lies, the pain, part of me still felt that loss. But I knew this was how it had to be. There was no going back, no fixing what had been broken beyond repair. Eventually, I stood up, pushing the chair back with a scrape, and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, I was walking this path alone. The house felt hollow after she left, as if her absence had drained it of all life. I wandered through the rooms, feeling like a ghost in my own home. The quiet was deafening, pressing down on me, suffocating me. This was the house where we had made memories, where we had built a life, where we had raised our kids. But now, it was just a shell, a place where everything had gone wrong. I found myself standing in the doorway of our bedroom, staring at the bed we had once shared. Her side was empty now, the sheets still rumpled from the last night she had slept there. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't control, images of her with him, of the moments they had shared behind my back. The betrayal was like a sickness, something that gnawed at my insides and refused to let go. I couldn't stay here. Not now. Not after everything. Grabbing my keys from the table, I headed back outside. The cold night air hit me again, but this time, it felt different. Less biting. More numbing. I drove with no destination, just like before, but this time I wasn't trying to cool off. I was trying to escape, to get as far away from that empty house and the painful memories it held as possible. I ended up at a bar on the outskirts of town, a dimly lit place that I had never been to before. It was the kind of bar where nobody asked questions, where everyone was there to drown their own demons. I pushed open the door, the faint smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hitting me as I stepped inside. The bartender didn't say a word, just nodded at me as I took a seat at the far end of the counter. I ordered a whiskey, something strong, something to burn away the ache in my chest. The first sip went down hard, but it did the job. It dulled the edges of the pain, just a little, enough to make me feel like I could breathe again. I stared down at the amber liquid, watching it swirl in the glass as the bar around me buzzed with low conversation and the clink of glasses. The world was still turning. People were still living their lives. But for me, everything had come to a standstill. It was like my life had split in two. The time before I knew the truth, and now, the hollow, bitter aftermath. "Rough night?" a voice asked from beside me. I glanced up and saw a man sitting a few stools away, his face half hidden in the dim light. He looked rough around the edges, his beard scruffy, his clothes worn, but his eyes were sharp, watching me with a knowing look. "You could say that," I muttered, not in the mood for small talk. He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving me. "Let me guess," he said after a moment. "Woman trouble?" I almost laughed at how painfully accurate that was. "Something like that." The man nodded, like he understood exactly what I meant. "I've been there," he said, his voice low and rough. "Hell, I think every guy in here has. You think you know someone, think you've got it all figured out, and then one day, bam, it all falls apart." I stared at him, surprised by how easily he had hit the nail on the head. "Yeah," I said quietly, turning the glass in my hand. "That's about right." The man leaned back in his stool, letting out a long sigh. "The thing is, it never goes the way you think it will. You spend all this time building something with someone, and when it falls apart, you wonder what the hell you were even doing in the first place. What was it all for?" I looked down at the glass, his words sinking in. "What was it for?" I echoed softly, feeling the weight of the question pressing down on me. "Maybe nothing," the man continued. "Or maybe it was for something. Maybe it was to show you what you can survive." I shook my head, feeling the anger bubbling up again. "It doesn't feel like surviving. It feels like I lost everything." The man chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "We all feel like that at first. But you'll see. You get up the next day, and the day after that, and somehow, you keep going. Maybe it's not the life you wanted, but it's still life. You still get to live it." I didn't know how to respond to that. I wasn't sure if he was right, or if he was just telling me what he thought I wanted to hear. But something about his words stuck with me, settled into the pit of my stomach like a heavy stone. Maybe I would survive this. Maybe I would get through it. But right now, it didn't feel like it. It felt like the world had crumbled beneath my feet, and I was still standing in the wreckage, not sure where to go next. I drained the rest of my whiskey and signaled for another. The bartender filled my glass without a word, and I took another slow sip, letting the burns slide down my throat. The man beside me didn't say anything else. He just sat there, drinking his beer, like he had already said all he needed to. And maybe he had. Maybe that was the thing about places like this. Everyone came here with their own broken pieces, their own stories of betrayal and loss, and nobody needed to explain it. They all just understood. After a while, I finished my drink and tossed some cash onto the bar. The alcohol had taken the edge off, made the ache in my chest a little more bearable. But it hadn't fixed anything. I knew that when I walked out of here, my problems would still be waiting for me. The empty house, the kids, the mess that Sarah had left behind. But the man's words stayed with me as I got up to leave. Maybe it was not about fixing everything. Maybe it was about surviving it, about getting through it, one day at a time. As I walked out of the bar and into the cool night air, I took a deep breath. The world outside was just as dark as it had been before, but somehow, it felt a little less suffocating. I still had no idea what the future held. I had no idea how I was going to navigate the wreckage of my life. But I knew one thing now. I could keep going. I could survive this. I had to. For me, and for the kids. The drive back home was quiet, the streets almost deserted as the clock edged closer to midnight. My head was still swimming from the whiskey, but I felt a strange sense of clarity, like the fog that had been clouding my mind had finally started to lift. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked even darker, lonelier than it had before. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, this place had felt like home. Now, it was just walls and empty spaces, haunted by memories of a life that no longer existed. I sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the front door, trying to summon the strength to go inside. The kids were still at Mrs. Jenkins' house, and I knew I had to pick them up in the morning. But tonight, this house was all mine, empty, quiet, and suffocating. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was waiting inside, and finally got out of the car. The moment I stepped inside, the silence hit me again, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I flipped on a few lights, but it did nothing to ease the oppressive feeling that hung in the air. The house felt like a tomb, filled with ghosts of the life Sarah and I had shared. A life I had thought was real, but now realized had been a lie. I wandered through the house aimlessly, my feet taking me from room to room, each one filled with memories I no longer wanted. The living room, where we had spent countless nights watching TV with the kids. The kitchen, where Sarah and I used to laugh and cook together before everything had gone wrong. And finally, the bedroom. I stood in the doorway, staring at the bed we had once shared. Her side of the bed was still rumpled, the imprint of her body faintly visible in the mattress. It felt like a slap in the face, a reminder of how quickly everything had changed. Just this morning, this room had felt normal. Now, it felt like the scene of a crime. I walked over to the bed, sitting down on the edge, my hands resting on my knees. My mind raced with everything that had happened. The fight, her tears, the betrayal. I could still hear her voice echoing in my head, begging me to understand, to forgive. But there was no forgiveness left in me. Not now. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found Mrs. Jenkins' number. I needed to call her, to tell her I would be by in the morning to pick up the kids. They deserved some kind of explanation, though I still had no idea how I was going to tell them that their mother would not be coming home. As I started to dial, a notification popped up, an email from Tim. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, knowing that whatever was in there, it was going to change everything. The email was short, just a few lines. But attached were several files, including the details of Sarah's affairs. Multiple affairs. More than I had even suspected. I stared at the screen, my eyes scanning the words, but my mind refusing to fully process them. Hotel bookings, receipts, messages, names, the cold, hard proof of her betrayal. She hadn't just cheated on me once or twice. This had been going on for nearly a year. And it hadn't just been with one guy. There were others. She had been meeting different men, using cash to cover her tracks, thinking she could outsmart me. But now, the truth was laid out in front of me, undeniable and devastating. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the messages. Each one felt like a fresh wound, reopening every piece of anger and hurt that I had tried to suppress. She had been careful, I would give her that, but not careful enough. Tim had found everything. As I reached the end of the email, I set the phone down and stared blankly at the wall. The weight of the betrayal felt unbearable, like the air was being sucked out of the room. I had suspected she was hiding something, but this was worse than I could have imagined. She had lied to me for so long, and I had been a fool to believe her. I had been blind, trusting, and in return, she had shattered everything we had built together. For a long time, I just sat there, my mind numb, the anger simmering beneath the surface but never quite breaking free. I had wanted the truth, and now I had it. But it felt like the truth had broken me more than the lies ever could have. Eventually, I stood up, feeling like my legs could barely hold me. I walked over to the window and looked out into the darkness, my reflection barely visible in the glass. The life I had known was gone. The woman I had loved was gone. But as I stood there, a strange sense of calm began to settle over me. The kind of calm that comes when you have nothing left to lose. I knew what I had to do next. I was going to call my lawyer, start the process of divorce, and make sure that Sarah would never have the chance to hurt me or our kids again. I was going to take back control of my life, one step at a time, even if it was going to be the hardest thing I had ever done. The road ahead was going to be painful, messy, but I could survive it. I would survive it. I thought about the kids, about how much they meant to me, about how I needed to be strong for them. I would not let Sarah's mistakes tear them apart. I would do everything in my power to protect them, to give them the life they deserved. As I turned away from the window, I felt a strange sense of resolve settling into my bones. I had been broken, yes, but I was not destroyed. The night stretched out before me, long and uncertain. But for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt like I was finally ready to face it. I walked back to the bedroom, turning off the lights as I went. Tomorrow was a new day, and no matter how hard it was going to be, I would get through it. I had to. I climbed into bed, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a blanket, but this time, it did not feel so suffocating. It felt like the beginning of something new, something that I would build on my own terms. And as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was going to be okay after all.